powerful "thank you" I've ever witnessed came from a creature science doesn't believe in. In the misty spring woods of Wisconsin, Park Ranger Barrett Lane heard a sound, something crying, but not like any animal he'd ever known. He followed the sound and found two small fur-covered beings huddled in a makeshift nest. At first, he thought they were bear cubs, until he looked into their eyes. Those eyes held something else: awareness, sorrow, and a quiet plea for help. No textbook had prepared him for this. Still, he brought them home, gave them names, Cinder and Sprout, and with the help of a kind widow named Vera, they raised the young creatures with nothing but warm milk, woolen cloth, and silent compassion. This video isn't just a strange tale. It's how a town rediscovered gentleness, how a mute boy began to speak again, and how a hunter dismantled his own traps. In just 7 minutes, you'll see how kindness can bridge worlds, even between humans and the unknown. One winter night, Sprout fell dangerously ill. But Vera saved him, with herbs, honey, and the memory of a son she once lost. That night, a giant figure appeared behind the fence, not to threaten, just to watch, just to wait. A mother from another kind. If you skip this story, you may never know. Some creatures once believed in us, long before we believed in ourselves. This story won't stay up forever. Like footprints in the snow, it may fade. But for now, it's still here, waiting. And before we begin, where are you watching from? Whether it's a quiet town like Marrow's Run or a big city halfway across the world, drop your location in the comments. We'd love to greet you the way Barrett would, quietly, kindly, but with all our heart. Under a pale April sky the color of wet ash, the woods along the edge of Marrow's Run breathed with the quiet restlessness of early spring. It had rained all night, not heavy, but fine and persistent, just enough to keep the earth soft and bleeding dark through last season's dead leaves. Barrett Lane moved steady through the forest, boots pressing down the damp ground with a kind of deliberate silence learned over years of being the only human presence in places like this. His route was routine. Same trail, same turns, same pace. He'd walked it so many times. The forest knew him and he knew it, like two neighbors who didn't speak but nodded each morning. But today, without quite knowing why, he stopped mid-step. It wasn't a sound at first. It was the absence of one. No birds, no insects. Just the hush of mist threading between bare branches and the slow breath of wet trees. And then, faint, barely there, a whimper. Not the yip of a coyote pup or the chatter of raccoons. It was thinner than that. Wounded, maybe. Strangled by effort. As if someone, or something, was trying not to cry, but couldn't hold it in. Barrett held still, one foot hovering above the ground, ears sharpening like antennae. The sound came again, lower, swallowed by the fog but not lost. A broken little sob. Childlike, but not. Something primal in it. Human and not. He stepped off the trail. The brush gave way beneath him with a hush of displaced dew. The farther he walked, the more the forest seemed to pull back. Crows didn't scold him. No twigs snapped underfoot. Even the rain lightened as if holding its breath. His eyes scanned the undergrowth, and then he saw it, tucked beneath the broken arch of a fallen pine and camouflaged by moss and limbs. A shelter. Primitive, but not random. Built, not burrowed. The branches were stacked deliberately. Ribbons of dry grass and woven rags lined the interior like bedding. A nest, a cradle, a place meant to hold something fragile. Barrett crouched, heart thudding now, not from fear, but a slow, dawning realization that whatever he'd found, it wasn't supposed to be found. Inside, curled tight against each other, were two small figures, barely larger than toddlers. covered in fine gray-brown fuzz. Their backs rose and fell in shallow, shivering breaths. One had its face buried into the crook of the other's shoulder. The other looked up. Their eyes met. Barrett forgot how to breathe. The creature blinked. Slow, intelligent, not the dull confusion of an animal. The eyes were deep-set, amber-touched, and impossibly clear. It didn't flinch, didn't growl, just watched him, like it was trying to remember where it knew him from. Its nose was flat, more human than bear. The fingers, yes, fingers, wrapped around a clump of moss, trembled but did not hide. And in that second, Barrett knew this was not a bear cub, not anything listed in the guides or the ranger manuals stacked on his shelf. He could have backed away, could have radioed it in, tag it, report it, follow the rules. But the rules didn't account for the way the smaller one pressed closer into the other's chest, or the way the older sibling, if that's what it was, shifted protectively, never taking its eyes off him. His training told him to record the coordinates, mark the site, call it in, let the wildlife authorities deal with the anomaly. But his body moved before his head caught up. Gently, slowly, he shrugged off his coat, opened it wide, and lowered it into the nest. Neither creature bolted. The smaller one whimpered. The older flinched, but didn't move. He murmured something, he didn't know what, and the moment stretched out like thread, pulled too tight. When his coat came up again, it carried both of them wrapped like two shivering secrets. He whispered the names without thinking. Cinder, he said, to the one that had looked him in the eyes. Sprout, to the one still tucked and trembling. Not tags, not labels, names. Because this wasn't a rescue, it was a beginning. He turned and started back toward the trail, his arms full of something neither man nor beast. Halfway up the ridge, rain swept in again, harder this time, clinging to his lashes and collar. He paused once at the crest and glanced back down the slope. That's when he saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, stood motionless at the tree line, half veiled in mist and rain. Massive shoulders, long limbs, no movement. It didn't step forward, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. The downpour blurred its features, but the outline was unmistakable. It wasn't a trick of shadow or a hand-carved stump. It was real, and it had seen him, and it had let him go. Barrett turned and walked the rest of the way in silence, boots sinking into the softened earth, arms steady beneath the coat that now held something alive and ancient and waiting. He did not look back again, but he felt it. The eyes, the presence, the slow breath of something old as the forest itself, following him not out of anger, but something else entirely. He didn't know it yet, but he had stepped into a story that had already been told for generations in rustling leaves and bent grass, in half-heard footfalls and whispers beneath rain. And now he was part of it, and the forest would remember. The rain had lessened by the time Barrett stepped off the gravel road and up the warped porch steps of Vera Loudon's cabin. The wood groaned under his boots, damp with spring fog and memory. He held the coat tight against his chest, arms cradling the strange weight that shifted gently under layers of wool and damp fabric. He didn't knock, just opened the screen door slow, careful not to startle anything breathing beneath the folds. The cabin smelled of cinnamon and something older, dried herbs, hand-washed linen, a lifetime of boiling broth and mending things that still had worth. Vera stood at the sink with her back to him, sleeves rolled, hands wringing a dish rag with the same steadiness she did everything. She turned without surprise, her gaze landing not on Barrett's face, but on the bundle in his arms. And then, wordlessly, she nodded once. She didn't ask what, she asked where. Barrett told her, his voice low, almost apologetic, about the shelter of branches, the trembling, the way they'd looked at him. Vera didn't blink. She set down the rag, wiped her palms on her apron, and cleared the table without a sound. Then she reached into the cupboard, pulled out a dented tin, and shook cornmeal into a pot already halfway filled with warm water. Her movements were practiced, as if some part of her had expected this exact moment. She lit the stove. Steam rose. The warmth filled the small space like a blanket. Barrett laid the coat down on the old quilted bench by the window. The creatures stirred, barely audible, Sprout pressing deeper into Cinder's chest, as if the world beyond the wool was still too loud. Vera knelt beside them, slow enough not to startle a feather. Her hands didn't reach yet, just hovered in the air like she was remembering the shape of something she'd once held long ago. She didn't speak, didn't ask, just looked. And then she stood, wiped her eyes with the side of one wrist, and went to retrieve a small ceramic bowl from the shelf above the fireplace. She poured the hot porridge in gently, added a bit of honey she kept for sore throats, and stirred with the handle of an old wooden spoon worn smooth by years. She set the bowl on the table, then placed a faded wool scarf beneath it, folding it like a cradle to hold the warmth in. Cinder blinked once, nose twitching at the scent. Sprout, still tucked behind, flinched at the creak of the door as wind pushed it open a hair, then shut again. Vera moved no faster than the shadows on the floor. She didn't offer the bowl. She didn't coax, just set it where it could be found and stepped back. It was enough. Barrett stepped outside and walked to the side structure, an old tool shed he'd patched up last fall when the roof sagged. With a little clearing, it would do. He stripped out the rusted nails, sanded splinters with his pocket knife, and stacked fresh straw in the corner thick enough to feel like a nest. He brought in a pot from the main house, filled it with boiled water Vera had cooled by the door, and added a second bowl, a soft cloth, and a small metal spoon, just in case. He didn't know what they'd eat. He only knew what they wouldn't. Fear. He wouldn't bring it in here. Vera, in the meantime, had written 3 notes by hand in a notebook with torn edges. She didn't speak them aloud, only pinned them to the inside wall of the shed, above the straw, like commandments written on parchment. The first read, "Do not cause pain." The second, "Do not teach fear." The third, "Do not boast of what was never yours." That night, after the porridge had cooled and Cinder had allowed a spoonful to pass their lips, while Vera sat nearby humming wordless tunes, Barrett placed both young ones gently into the straw-lined corner of the shed, his hands moving like a father who'd never had children. Sprout clung to Cinder, still shivering, even as the warmth from their shared breath fogged the nearby jar of water. Vera left the door cracked, not to keep air moving, but to let the silence speak. When the rain started again, tapping against the tin roof in soft, stuttering rhythms, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and hummed lower. Not a lullaby. Something older. Something you didn't learn so much as remember. Barrett stood by the doorway, eyes not on the children, but on Vera's hand. She was resting it lightly on Sprout's back, not petting, not pressing, just enough for the child to feel a presence without weight. And something in that gesture caught in his throat, not the way she touched, but the way she didn't. Her palm so still it didn't even cast a shadow. She stayed that way until the small body beneath her fingers stopped trembling. Later, as Barrett walked back to the cabin, he felt something shift inside him, the way a room feels different when someone's left it. The night wasn't louder, it was closer. He turned once, halfway across the gravel path, and saw nothing. No movement, no eyes. But he knew in a way he couldn't name, that something was watching. Not hostile, not protective either. Just present. The next morning, the sun slipped through the thinning clouds like it had somewhere else to be. Vera was already up, warming milk on the stove, her hands moving slowly but precisely, as always. Barrett stepped into the shed and found the straw disturbed in a pattern that suggested careful movement, not panic. The water jar was half empty, the bowl licked clean. Sprout peeked out, blinked at him, and didn't retreat. Cinder was already watching, that same deep, knowing stillness behind the eyes. Barrett knelt, just far enough to not seem imposing, and murmured something about the weather, the birds, the deer that liked the far fence line. He didn't expect a response, but Cinder tilted their head slightly, like they were trying to place the rhythm of his words, like they were learning. Not language, something older. That day, he added a latch to the shed door, not to lock it, but to keep out wind. He reinforced the window with a clear pane he'd scavenged from the barn. He built a small shelf low to the ground for bowls and cloths. Every gesture was quiet, every nail hammered soft. This was not a structure anymore. It was a room, a sanctuary, a line drawn in pine and straw between what they had been and what they might become. By evening, the children had ventured to the doorway. Not far, just close enough to feel the warmth of the sun that slipped through the last slats of daylight. Sprout was first to pull back when a crow landed nearby. Cinder remained, breathing slow, eyes scanning the trees not with fear, but with familiarity. Like someone listening for a voice they recognized but couldn't yet hear. Inside, Vera had laid out 2 hand-stitched cloths beside bowls of mashed sweet potato and soft bread soaked in warm milk. She didn't ask Barrett what they should eat. She simply cooked what a child could keep down. She still blew gently on each spoon before setting them down, a habit she'd never broken since the days her own son had been small enough to sit in a high chair made of pine and promise. And that night, when the wind howled louder and the sky closed in with another thin drizzle, she sang again. No lyrics, just breath turned to melody, a language spoken only by mothers who had long since buried their voices in the spaces between storms. And in the shed, the straw no longer shifted with panic. It breathed, and in the darkness, Barrett sat in his truck, watching the outline of the small shed against the trees, listening not for danger, but for quiet. For the kind that meant peace had settled, at least for now. He didn't sleep, but he didn't leave. And in the trees beyond the fence line, something very tall stood still as bark, watching the cabin, not with anger, not with fear, just waiting. Waiting for what? Barrett didn't know. But the woods were listening now, and silence, in places like Marrow's Run, always meant something was about to change. Summer pressed into Marrow's Run like honey warming in the sun, thick and slow, curling at the edges of everything green and alive. The kind of summer where nothing moved fast unless it had wings, and even then, birds thought twice before crossing open fields in the heat. Vera's cabin sat still in it, half shadowed by poplars with whispering leaves, its windows open just wide enough to let the air move. Inside the shed, the quiet had become normal, the breathing steady, the rhythm of 2 hearts learning how to exist without being afraid. Cinder had grown more watchful, not in fear, but in the way something wild begins to calculate its place. Sprout clung tighter on some days, looser on others, like trust came in small doses and had to be earned again with each sunrise. On the other side of the property line, Cassidy Bloom sat cross-legged on her porch step, sketchbook propped on her knees, pencils smudging the soft curve of a branch she'd seen shift too fast the night before. She was 17 and quiet in a way that made people assume she was bored or moody. But she wasn't either. She just watched more than she spoke, drew more than she smiled, and had a way of seeing shapes in shadows that made her teachers nervous and her grandmother proud. Her hair curled in the humidity, pulled up in a messy knot, and her bare toes tapped against the warm wood as she squinted toward Vera's yard. Something had moved there again last night. Not a raccoon, not a deer, something heavier. She hadn't told anyone, hadn't even written it in her journal. Instead, she kept returning to the same spot on the page, shading the outline of a doorway with light spilling just behind it. That morning, while Vera hummed and Barrett fixed a cracked step on the side of the shed, Cassidy wandered closer. She didn't knock. She just sat on the edge of the front stoop and opened her book again, pencil poised, eyes drifting over the barn's weathered siding. She didn't draw the creatures. She didn't know what they looked like. But she drew the light differently now, always behind something, always too warm for the hour. She sketched angles like memory instead of fact. And slowly, her pencil found new shapes. Hands with long fingers that didn't belong to any human she'd met. Eyes just out of frame, low and thoughtful. Down the gravel road, Owen Kettering crouched behind the trunk of a bent spruce, fingers sticky with pine resin, watching Cassidy from a distance. He didn't mean to follow her. He just liked the way she sat still like trees do. Owen was 8. Hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not since the night his father's truck had gone off the ridge road and nobody came back from the wreck but his backpack and a glove with a hole in the thumb. He didn't cry much. He didn't smile much. He just sat near things that made him feel safe. And today, that was Cassidy. When she turned slightly, sensing something nearby, he stepped out of the trees, silent as moss, and sat beside her without asking. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She just handed him her other pencil and a page. And together, they drew. When Barrett stepped out of the shed a half hour later, wiping his hands on his jeans, he saw them there. 2 kids, back to back, faces tilted down but aware. Owen glanced up first, not at Barrett, at the shed. And then, without saying a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a glass marble the color of late summer skies. It was his favorite, his only one that hadn't chipped. He held it for a second like he was thinking of changing his mind. But he didn't. He walked to the edge of the shed's wooden threshold, knelt, and placed the marble just inside, right where shadow met sun. Then he stepped back and sat down again. From within the shed, Cinder emerged slowly, silent as breath. Sprout hovered behind, fingers clenched in the hem of the old wool blanket. Cinder saw the marble, tilted their head, and stepped forward. One finger, thick, long, uncertain, touched the glass, rolled it once. Then Cinder picked it up, turned it in their palm, and looked at Owen. They didn't blink, didn't smile. But something passed between them, like a message too old for words. And after a moment, Cinder placed the marble back down and gently nudged it toward the boy. Owen picked it up again and held it tight, his shoulders lifting just slightly. That night, Barrett noticed the grass by the fence had been pressed down. Not trampled, not dug, pressed, in long, even patches, as if someone had stood very still for a very long time. The pattern didn't match deer, didn't match elk, and the fence hadn't been touched. No wires bent, no boards broken, just presence. He followed the trail for 20 feet, maybe 30, until it disappeared into the deeper pines. No footprints, just silence, the kind that felt like watching. He didn't tell Vera, not yet. He didn't want her worried. But that evening, he did sit a little longer on the porch. He cleaned his shotgun without loading it, just in case. The next morning, Vera poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to Barrett without a word. She'd seen it too, probably. Maybe not the prints, but the change in the air. The way the wind hesitated before moving. The way the birds only sang in half notes now. "I've been thinking," Barrett said, staring into the steam. Vera didn't answer. She just waited. "I might need help. Someone who understands things, but won't sell us out." Vera stirred her cup with the tip of a spoon, slow and steady. "You already know who." And he did. 2 days later, Lila North showed up at the edge of the trail in a weatherproof jacket 2 sizes too big, binoculars around her neck, and a field notebook half filled with sketches of migratory birds. She didn't look like much, just another biologist with a coffee addiction and an unhealthy relationship with her backpack. But Barrett trusted her, not because she had degrees or maps or Latin names for things. He trusted her because she listened before she looked. And when he told her, quietly, carefully, not all at once, about the shelter, the eyes, the breathing in the dark, she didn't laugh, didn't write it down either. Instead, she said, "Okay, show me." They sat by the lake that afternoon. On the bench, Vera's late husband had built from driftwood and salvaged metal. The light on the water looked like poured gold, thin and slow. Lila spoke in low tones about animal displacement, genetic drift, interspecies defense behaviors. Words that sounded clinical but came out soft. Barrett told her about the marble, about the pressed grass, about the way Cinder tilted their head when he spoke. She didn't ask to see them. She said, "When they're ready." He nodded, and they let the sun sink without rushing it. Elsewhere, on the edge of town, Mac Drury sat hunched at the counter of Glenn's Hardware, his hands calloused and too big for the styrofoam coffee cup between them. He listened without listening to the men behind him talk about sightings. Not deer, not coyotes. Something else. Something tall. Something moving just outside the range of their flashlights. And he didn't say a word. Just sipped his coffee and thought about what he'd heard 2 weeks ago outside Vera's property. A sound he couldn't name. A shadow that made him hold his breath. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. But he was starting to wonder if Barrett Lane was hiding something. And Mac had always believed that secrets, like debts, never stayed buried long. The summer deepened. The days stretched like taffy. And in the spaces between the ordinary, something old was stirring. Watching, choosing when to be seen. And not everyone who saw would understand. But the ones who did. The ones who knelt to offer marbles. Who drew light instead of shapes. Who watched and waited and stayed quiet. They were already part of the story. They just didn't know it yet. The woods looked different when fall first touched them. Less like a place to walk through, and more like a place that watched back. Sometime in late September, when the mornings turned to fog and the leaves began to dry from the inside, Barrett and Lila returned to the hollow where everything had started. The light was cold and low, filtered through thinning crowns of maple and ash, and the path that once carried soft moss now crunched beneath their boots like a warning whispered too late. They didn't speak much on the way in. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like each of them already knew what they were about to find wouldn't be kind. The air in the hollow was heavier than Barrett remembered. The kind of stillness that settles in a room that's been left mid-argument. The structure of branches and raked moss that had once cradled Cinder and Sprout was broken apart now, not from weather or time, but force. Some branches snapped clean. Others were twisted unnaturally, as if something had panicked, something strong. The bedding had been clawed through. There were streaks of torn-up earth leading to the tree line like something had been dragged and resisted. And at the base of a split cedar, 3 gouges had been driven deep into the bark, jagged, dark, and deliberate. They didn't belong to a bear. They didn't belong to any animal Barrett knew. Lila crouched near the base of the tree, her gloved fingers tracing the dried sap where the cuts had bled. She didn't look at him right away, just said quietly, "They didn't leave. They were pushed." Her voice didn't carry judgment, only the weight of understanding. Barrett stepped around the remnants of the shelter, eyes scanning for detail, his chest tight. He didn't expect to find bodies, but he also didn't expect to find nothing. On the far edge of the hollow, half covered by dirt and sticks, he saw a patch of matted fur, brown with silver streaks, longer than Cinder or Sprout's, stiff with old blood. He knelt and gently pulled it loose. A thick burr clung to one edge, and woven into it was something unnatural, a fragment of metal wire, thin and barbed. It wasn't a fence piece. It wasn't dropped gear. It was trap wire. New. Not rusted. Not local. Barrett stared at it like it might confess something, but it only lay there, silent and accusing. Lila moved closer. "That's not from here," she said. That's brought in. Someone's setting traps for something bigger than coyotes. Barrett didn't answer. He couldn't yet. They gathered the broken branches and buried the shredded bedding under a layer of fallen leaves. Not to hide it, just to give it back to the ground. Lila pressed her hand once against the tree trunk, almost in apology, and then they left. Back in town, the air had changed in quieter ways. The talk in the diner was different. It wasn't about deer herds or early frost anymore. It was about sounds at night. Lights moving through the trees. Someone had found claw marks on their shed door. Another had lost 3 chickens with no sign of a break-in. And someone swore they saw a figure bigger than any man walking upright along the old fence line behind the grain silo. Rumors wore new faces now. Not curiosity, not ridicule, just caution. Vera told Cassidy and Owen to start checking the shed perimeter every morning, quietly, thoroughly. She showed them how to brush the earth with pine branches to soften any prints, how to sweep away tracks that didn't belong. Cassidy took it like a ritual. Owen took it like a promise. And both of them understood they were protecting something that couldn't protect itself, at least not in the ways the world demanded. Lila suggested putting up signage around the edge of Vera's land. Simple markers, nothing too official. She drafted a permit application under the Wildlife Conservation Act, citing the area as a protected corridor for migratory bird recovery. It was thin, but it would buy them time. Keep out the casual wanderers. Maybe even stall the curious ones who ask too many questions. Barrett helped her stake the signs. 4 corners, thick brush, old foot trails. It wasn't a fence, just a warning. Still, every night he walked the line. It became habit, like breathing. Before bed, he circled the shed, the cabin, the edge of the woods. One night after the rain, he found something near the porch steps, half buried in mud, no larger than his open palm. A print, 5 fingers, not clawed, not bare, just wide, padded and deep. Too deep for a child, too clean for an accident. The shape of a hand, one that had placed itself there, not in a rush, not with anger, with care, with presence, like someone reaching gently across a line they weren't sure they were still allowed to cross. He didn't wake Vera, didn't tell Lila. He stood there a long time, the lantern in his hand trembling just slightly, light flickering on the wet earth. Something watched him from the trees. He couldn't see it, but he felt it in the back of his neck, the way hunters feel when they're the ones being tracked. And then it was gone. No sound, no movement. Just a sudden shift in pressure, like the air had sighed and drawn back. Inside, Cinder stirred in the straw. Sprout whimpered once and curled tighter. Barrett locked the shed door that night, not to keep them in, to keep something else out. The next morning, the print had faded. The mud dried and cracked, but the shape stayed in his mind. They ate breakfast quiet that day. Vera made corn muffins and split them warm, adding honey she'd traded for in town. Cassidy sipped coffee like she was older than she was. Owen drew in the corner, not looking up when Cinder peeked through the shed door. The world had shifted. Not a lot. Just enough that no one spoke about it. They just felt it. And that was enough. Later, Barrett returned to the hollow alone. He needed to look again, to see if anything had returned. The air was colder, the light thinner, the broken shelter still covered. But near the cedar tree, he saw something new. Fresh bark peeled from the trunk, not by claws this time, but by fingers. Deliberate, careful. He followed the trail backward, slow, every sense stretched tight, and halfway up the ridge, on a ledge overlooking the creek, he found another print. Not on the ground. On a flat stone, pressed with moisture. Barely visible, but unmistakable. A message, not a threat, not a claim. A reminder. They were still here, watching, waiting. And in that long breath of wind that followed, Barrett understood something he hadn't before. He wasn't just sheltering 2 younglings anymore. He was standing in the middle of someone else's territory, and the rules were changing. The storm rolled in just after dark, not from the west like it usually did, but from the north, where the trees stood taller and the wind carried a sharper edge. It came without warning, like something that had been holding its breath for weeks had finally exhaled. The air turned metallic. Pine needles curled. The sky dropped low. Then the wind slammed into Merrow's Run, like it meant to shake the bones of the valley loose. Trees bent. Tin roofs trembled. Somewhere in the distance, a power line snapped, and the night blinked. And on the porch of Vera Loudon's cabin, the old woman sat motionless in her rocking chair, her breath shallow, her eyes half closed, hands gripping the arms like she could feel the pressure shifting inside her chest before her pulse had time to catch up. When Barrett reached her, she looked up like nothing was wrong, voice even, steady, a whisper through a storm. "I'm all right. Just a little heavy today." Inside the shed, the walls groaned under the weight of the wind. A shutter banged once, then again. Cinder moved to the doorway, silent as always, shoulders braced, back turned to shield Sprout, who had buried himself into the straw, ears flat, body coiled. A gust shook the latch, and a small branch struck the roof like a warning knock. Cinder didn't growl, didn't bare teeth. They made a sound low and strange, almost like a hum flattened into a warning. A short, vibrating note that hung in the air like it was meant to be felt, not heard. It wasn't angry, it wasn't panic, just enough to say, "This is mine. Don't come closer." Mac Drury stepped out of the trees, soaked to the bone, boots heavy with mud, coat sticking to his frame. He hadn't meant to walk this far, not in this weather, but something had pulled him off his porch. Maybe the way the air had gone silent before the wind, or the way his dogs had barked at the woods without reason, or maybe it was just the weight of everything he hadn't said out loud. He crossed Vera's fence in the dark, one hand on the rusted latch, the other already tightening into a fist around the flashlight he hadn't turned on. His eyes tracked the shed, then froze. He wasn't sure what he saw at first. A shape in the doorway. A figure too tall, too still. His breath caught. The flashlight clicked on. But Barrett was already on the porch, shovel in hand, not raised like a weapon, but carried with purpose. His voice didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just said, quiet, like it mattered more than the storm. "There are things that don't belong to us. You know that, Mac." Rain hit harder. The trees behind the shed cracked like bones shifting. Cassidy stood just inside the main doorway, soaked to her ribs, sketchbook clutched to her chest, her hair plastered to her forehead. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at Mac like he was the only thing keeping something fragile from staying whole. Owen stepped out behind her, small and still barefoot, tugging at Mac's sleeve like he meant to pull a tree out of the wind. He didn't say a word, just looked up at the older man with eyes too wide for a storm like this. And then lightning split the sky above the tree line, white and violent. For a second, the whole yard lit up. Mac saw everything, the edge of Cinder's outline, the stillness in their stance, the way Sprout clung to their side, terrified but protected, and something inside him broke. He let go of the shed latch. He stepped back. The flashlight dropped into the mud. Barrett didn't speak again. Didn't need to. The shed door clicked softly shut behind him, as if someone had guided it closed without a sound. Mac stood in the rain, water rolling down his face, no longer certain if it was sweat or guilt, or just everything too big to name. Cassidy slowly reached out, took Owen's hand, and pulled him back toward the light. The boy followed, but not before turning back one last time to look at the shed. Something inside it moved. Just a shift of breath. A child's sigh. Then nothing. Vera hadn't moved from her chair. She just exhaled. The kind of exhale that people take when they realize their body's still here. When morning came, The storm had stripped branches and scattered pine cones across the yard like offerings. The grass was torn in places, leaves plastered to the shed walls, one shutter hanging loose. But the structure still stood. Inside, the straw was damp but not soaked, the blankets slightly displaced. Two small bodies curled beneath them, one wrapped around the other like they'd always slept that way. The breathing was slow, peaceful, even. Near the porch, a length of metal wire glinted in the soft sun, one of Mac's old traps, bent and rusted, coiled back into the shape of a noose. Barrett found it later, pulled from the edge of the fence and left on the third step of the porch. Not by wind, not by accident. It hadn't snapped. It had been unhooked, unwound, placed, like someone had decided enough was enough. Barrett picked it up, coiled it tighter, and carried it to the shed. He didn't throw it away. He just hung it beside the tools, not as a threat, as a reminder. Later that day, Mac returned. He didn't knock, just stepped quietly up to the porch and placed 2 jars on the mat, one filled with dark golden honey, the other with sliced ginseng root soaked in something that smelled like time and memory. His grandmother used to make it for children with coughs that wouldn't go away. He set the jars down, knocked once, soft, more like a touch than a sound, and walked off without a word. Cinder watched from the shed window, not hiding, just present. That night, Vera sat beside Sprout, pressing a warm cloth to his chest, the scent of steeped herbs rising from the bowl beside her. His breathing had been uneven since the storm, a rattle, like leaves dragging across a wooden floor. His eyes stayed shut. His hands clenched cinders. Barrett sat nearby, one boot tapping the floor without rhythm. Lila leaned against the doorframe, a notepad in her hand, filled with pages she hadn't opened in hours. No one spoke about doctors. No one spoke about laboratories. They only moved slowly, carefully, softly. At one point, Lila stepped outside, opened her notebook, stared at the page filled with words and diagrams and a chance, one that could change her name, her field, her career. Then she tore the page out, crumpled it, and let it fall into the mud. Her breath shook once, and then she went back in. Barrett noticed the gesture, didn't comment. Some things didn't need to be said. Cinder hadn't moved from Sprout's side in hours. They made a low humming sound sometimes, soft and even, the kind of noise a parent might make when they've run out of lullabies. Owen sat by the shed door, hands folded in prayer, though no one had taught him how, eyes shut tight. Cassidy left a fresh sketch under the blanket near Sprout's feet, a drawing of the 2 siblings sitting beneath a pine tree that looked more like a cathedral. By morning, the worst had passed. The breathing was clearer, the fever broken. Barrett turned away when it happened, his shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched. Not because he didn't want to be seen, but because the relief hit too hard. He stepped outside, wiping his eyes before they spilled, and paused when he saw it. Just beyond the fence, a figure, tall, still, not moving, not threatening, just there, waiting. And Barrett understood, without needing to ask, that it hadn't left. It had stayed. Not to take, but to make sure the ones left behind were safe. Not everything sacred makes itself known. Some things just wait in the shadows until they're sure they've been heard. The first snow came soft and slow, like it had been waiting for silence to fall before slipping into town. The roofs along the ridgeline turned white by late afternoon, and the dirt road leading to Vera's house dulled beneath a dusting so light it looked like breath frozen mid-air. The valley changed with it, sounds dampened, trees muted, everything carrying the quiet weight of winter beginning. Sprout started coughing again that morning. Not much at first, but it deepened by nightfall into something low and wet that pulled from too far down. Vera felt his forehead with the back of her hand, said nothing, but set a pot of water to boil and started steeping leaves from the bundle she'd kept wrapped in twine above the hearth since August. Her motions were slow, methodical, her breath barely moving past her lips. Cinder wouldn't leave Sprout's side, not even to eat. Not even when Vera lit the oil lamp and let the heat fill the corners of the room like steam rising off memory. Barrett stood just outside the shed, leaning one hand against the frame, the other gripping a mug he'd already forgotten to drink. He watched Sprout's chest rise and fall beneath the wool blankets, watched Cinder place a hand on his shoulder like they could pull the sickness out with just their presence. The boy wheezed, thin lines of sound breaking through sleep. Lila arrived just after sundown, boots crunching snow, her breath rising in short, steady clouds. She didn't speak when she came in, just knelt near Vera, examined the herbs with a quick nod, and began washing her hands with the boiled water they'd set aside for cleaning. They had no antibiotics, no monitors, just the kind of knowledge passed down in hushes and gestures, how to break a fever with warmth and patience, how to trust touch over tools, how to listen when a body didn't speak in words. Lila moved quietly through the space, teaching with her hands, her voice low and even. She showed Vera how to wring out the cloths and replace them when they cooled. Showed Barrett how to tip the boy gently to one side if the rattling got worse. But no one used the word dying. No one even whispered it. That night, as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, Barrett stood alone outside, staring into the dark beyond the fence. The trees didn't move. The snow fell straight down, quiet as ash. But he felt it again. That presence. Not close. Not watching. Just near enough to remind him they weren't alone. Not even now. He wanted to say something. Wanted to ask for help. But the words caught behind his ribs. Not because he didn't believe, but because he didn't know what he was asking for. Back inside, Vera hummed a tune so soft it almost wasn't there. Not a lullaby. Something older. Maybe a hymn from a childhood she no longer remembered the words to. Sprout's skin burned and chilled in waves, breath hitching, then smoothing, then hitching again. Cinder barely blinked, their body a barrier, their hand resting so gently on Sprout's chest that not even dust rose beneath it. Cassidy came by with a bag of apples and left them on the porch. She didn't knock, didn't say a word. But later, when Vera sliced one and laid it in a bowl near the boy's head, he turned just slightly toward the scent. Owen arrived without a coat, his arms tucked into his sweater, his eyes too big for his small face. He sat cross-legged by the door, hands folded like prayer, lips moving but making no sound. Vera didn't tell him to leave, didn't tell him to sleep. She simply handed him a blanket and let him be. The shed that night felt less like a place to hide and more like a chapel where no one dared breathe too loud. Outside, the trees groaned beneath the weight of new snow. Inside, the only sound was the slow drip of melting ice into the tin pail near the window and the soft rhythm of Cinder humming again, that strange, low tone that somehow kept the night from unraveling. Lila stepped outside just once, her breath sharp, her fingers shaking. She pulled her notebook from her coat, flipped it open, and stared at the page she'd started to write days ago. Data, observation, possibility. She held it in both hands for a moment, then tore it free, crumpled it tight, and let the wind take it. Not because it wasn't true, but because some truths didn't belong on paper. They belonged in places where snow fell straight and quiet, where breathing was enough to keep someone here. She went back inside without wiping her eyes. Mac came before dawn. He didn't knock, just left a jar of honey and a bundle of roots by the steps. The roots were dry and tangled, but Vera knew them by touch. Horehound, elderflower, licorice, things his grandmother used to boil for sick children when winters came early. He placed the bundle down, tapped the railing once with his knuckle, and walked away. Barrett watched from the window, the light from the lantern painting slow-moving shadows across his face. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Sprout's fever broke just before sunrise, not suddenly, not like a miracle. more like something gradually loosening its grip. His breath steadied, his fingers uncurled, his skin cooled, and when he finally opened his eyes, they were glassy but alert, looking past Cinder and straight into the morning light bleeding through the crack in the wood. Vera pressed her palm to his forehead and smiled without smiling, her eyes closing for the first time in hours. Barrett stepped back, exhaling into his hands, his shoulders falling all at once like he'd been carrying a mountain no one else could see. Cinder didn't move, just held Sprout's hand tighter. Owen was asleep in the corner, curled in his blanket like a stone in a river. Cassidy's drawing from the day before sat beneath the candle. A sketch of two figures under snow-heavy pines, one taller, arms around the other. A single line of warmth drawn between their chests like smoke. Barrett walked out into the fresh light, boots cracking the frozen crust of snow beneath him. He didn't have anywhere to go. He just needed to be still. And that's when he saw it again. Just past the fence. A figure, not moving, not threatening, just present. Tall, still. The air didn't change, the trees didn't sway. But the moment stretched between them like a string pulled tight, unspoken and unmistakable. The figure didn't step forward, didn't vanish, just waited. Barrett stood there a long time, and then he nodded. Not big, not bold, just enough to say, "I see you." And in that moment he didn't feel alone, not even a little. Spring didn't come with a burst that year. It crept in slow, in damp roots and soft mornings, in the way the wind shifted just enough to carry the scent of thawed earth instead of snow. By early March, the edges of Merrow's Run had begun to hum again, low, tentative, like the forest was waking up from something deep. The trees hadn't budded yet, but the sap had started to rise. Barrett knew that feeling. It was in his legs, too, in the way he stepped outside each morning and didn't brace against the cold as much, in the way he looked toward the woods and no longer expected to see shadows that didn't belong. And he knew what it meant. He'd known for weeks. He just hadn't said it out loud. Not to Vera, not to Lila, not even to himself. It was time. He stood on the porch with a thermos in one hand and a wool scarf in the other, the same one Vera had laid over Sprout's chest during his worst night. It still held the faintest trace of the herbs she'd crushed into it. He ran his fingers along the frayed edge as Vera stepped out beside him. She didn't ask. She didn't speak. She simply looked out across the still wet yard, eyes narrowing slightly at the steam lifting from the patch of straw in the shed. Inside, Cinder had begun sleeping upright again, back pressed to the wall, like they were waiting. Sprout moved more now, ate better. The cough had faded. His eyes were brighter. But he still didn't stray far from Cinder, didn't reach for things without checking where his siblings stood. Barrett finally said the words in the smallest voice he had. "We should take them back." Vera nodded slowly. "You sure?" she asked, though the answer had already settled in her chest days ago. "Yeah," Barrett said. "Before the ground gets too soft, before they get too used to us." She didn't argue. She turned, went inside, and came back out minutes later with the scarf folded in her hands, like she was offering him a photograph she didn't want to keep but couldn't throw away. She gave it to him without meeting his eyes. He took it and didn't speak. Neither of them did. Cassidy sat at the kitchen table with a pencil in her hand and a piece of paper she hadn't touched yet. She'd drawn them dozens of times, shapes hidden behind trunks, outlines of limbs too long for the trees, eyes like reflections in still water. But today, she stared at the blank page. Her hand hovered above it, then slowly slid the paper away. She tore out the last page in her sketchbook, a blank one, and folded it twice before slipping it into the cloth bag Vera used to carry jars to the farmer's market. She tied the bag shut and left it by the door. Outside, Owen crouched by the shed door with the same blue marble clutched tight in his palm. He didn't look up as Barrett approached, just held the marble out like it was something heavier than glass. Barrett crouched beside him, palm open, and Owen placed the marble in it, then closed Barrett's fingers one by one without a word. Barrett's throat tightened. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded bandana from his own pocket, red and soft and faded, and tied it gently around Owen's wrist. Something to remember. Something that wouldn't roll away. Lila packed food without being asked. Sliced apples, dried meat. 2 small water flasks she'd cleaned herself. She didn't speak much either, just handed the pack to Barrett and held her eyes on the ground, like she wasn't ready to see it happen yet. The forest was damp that morning, but not unfriendly. The moss clung to boots and tree roots glistened, but the fog lifted by noon, revealing the slope of the ridge like it was leading them somewhere purposeful. Cinder walked ahead, holding Sprout's hand. Neither of them looked back. Barrett kept distance, but close enough to step in if needed. He didn't speak, didn't whistle, just followed, his boots pressing into the earth with quiet understanding. They reached the hollow by late afternoon, where light filtered down like amber through branches still bare. The same place he'd found them almost a year ago. The same curve of rock, the same broken cedar. It hadn't healed. But it wasn't jagged anymore either. Cinder stopped at the edge of the clearing. Sprout stayed behind them. Barrett waited. The wind shifted. The air changed. And then she stepped out. She was taller than he remembered. Broad across the shoulders, her fur darker, but her face was unmistakable. High-browed, wide-eyed, with that same impossible calm. Her eyes met Barrett's, and he felt it like a physical touch. Not welcome, not warning, just acknowledgement. Sprout let go of Cinder's hand and took a step forward. Then another. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of wet bark and something older beneath it. A second figure emerged, a younger male, more agitated, posture rigid. He took a half step toward Barrett, but stopped when the female lifted one hand and placed it on his chest. Just a touch, no force. And the clearing fell still again. Barrett reached into his coat and pulled out the marble, held it out flat in his palm. Sprout moved closer, lifted the marble with both hands, turned back once to glance at Cinder, and then tucked it against his chest before walking into the space between the trees. The mother didn't step forward. She didn't take them by the hand. But they moved toward her all the same, like the pull of a tide, like breath returning after being held too long. Barrett stood where he was, heart thudding, throat dry. She stepped closer. Not enough to touch, just enough for him to see her eyes clearly. Then, slow as dusk, she reached out and pressed her fingertips to his sleeve. Just a brush. A silent thank you from something that didn't speak his language, but understood what it meant to give something back without breaking it. And then, they were gone, slipping into the brush like shadows drawn in charcoal, the undergrowth shifting behind them. But no sound rising, just silence, and the deep hum of the forest knitting itself closed again. Barrett stood there long after they vanished, his fingers still warm from where she'd touched him. The sun lowered. The cold returned. He didn't move. Didn't need to, because for the first time, there was no ache in the letting go, only a weight lifted, and the forest, for once, didn't feel like it was holding its breath. By the time summer circled back around, Marrow's Run had settled into a kind of hush that wasn't silence, but memory holding its breath. The air still smelled of pine and old stone, but the weight in the wind had shifted. It no longer curled around Barrett's boots when he walked the boundary line. It didn't press so tightly into Vera's chest when she opened her door to greet the morning sun. The forest had changed, or maybe the people had. Either way, something had been returned, and everything since had moved more carefully in its wake. Mac didn't talk about what happened. Not to anyone. Not even to himself. But that spring, he started showing up at the elementary school every Saturday, with a spade in one hand and a bucket of saplings in the other. Didn't ask for permission. Didn't wait for thanks. He dug holes, tied strings, drove stakes, showed the kids how to cover a young root system without packing the dirt too tight. Then stepped back and let them do the rest. When people asked him why he did it, he just shrugged and muttered something about soil erosion or new zoning laws. No one pushed. But the older kids noticed he never turned his back to the tree line, and one of the first graders said she saw him whisper something once. To the woods, Cassidy won a regional art prize in June. The judges said her work had a haunting quiet and a strange emotional absence that pulls you in. The paintings were all forest scenes, soft sunlight, no figures, no motion, just trees and trails and long open spaces that somehow looked like someone had just left or was about to arrive. When reporters asked her why no people appeared in any of her pieces, she smiled and said, "Because sometimes empty is already full." She mailed one of the paintings to Vera, unsigned, wrapped in brown paper with a pressed fern taped to the corner. Owen started talking again. Not much, not loudly, but enough. One day he told his mother that sometimes keeping a story inside didn't make it smaller. It just made it heavier. And when she tried to ask what that meant, he said it wasn't for her to carry, just to hear. He still kept the marble, still cupped it in his palm on long walks. But now he brought it back to his room afterward, washed it in a bowl, dried it with the red bandana tied to his doorknob. He didn't treat it like a toy. He treated it like a promise. Vera added a set of wooden wind chimes to the front porch. Not fancy, just driftwood and twine. They didn't ring like normal ones. They clicked, tapped, moved gently. But they made no real music. When asked why she didn't hang a proper metal set, she said she didn't want music. She just wanted reminders. Every time the wind nudged them, she paused whatever she was doing. Stirring soup, shelling peas, folding towels, and she'd close her eyes and breathe slower, like something outside had whispered, "Still here." Barrett kept walking the forest edge at sunset. Same pace, same path, same care. He didn't expect to see them again. That wasn't the point. Some things weren't about wanting. They were about honoring. He trimmed back overgrown brush, cleared storm-fallen limbs, left apples sometimes. Dried berries tucked beneath the edge of a rock near the clearing where the cedar still bore its scars. He never saw hands take them, but they were never there in the morning. Every so often, usually when the air turned sweet with humidity and the crickets had just started their evening chorus, he'd catch a flicker of movement at the edge of his sight. A shape. A blur. Nothing solid. Nothing loud. Just enough to know he was not alone. And he never reached for it. Never stepped closer. Some distances weren't meant to be closed. Some were there to keep respect intact. In late July, he found a small bundle of woven grass on his porch step. 3 loops, 1 knot, tight and dry. It hadn't been blown there. It hadn't fallen. It had been left. Not as a message, as a mirror. That night, he didn't sleep right away. Just sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the floor creak as the house adjusted to the cooler air. He ran his thumb across the grass, not trying to understand it, just feeling the texture, the rhythm. He set it on the windowsill before dawn, next to the glass jar with the feather in it. The one Sprout had once tucked into Cassidy's sketchbook. The one Cassidy had returned without a word. Marrow's Run didn't talk about what happened, not as a whole. But the change lingered in the way people moved. They spoke softer near the woods, picked up their trash when hiking the trails. Kids threw sticks into creeks instead of stones. The sheriff stopped by Barrett's house one afternoon, not for business, just to drop off a box of old trail markers and a tin of cornbread his wife had made. He stood on the porch a long time, squinting toward the trees, then said, "You ever think we're not the first ones living here?" Barrett nodded once, and that was that. No one used the word Bigfoot, not even in whispers. The town didn't need a name for what they'd learned. What mattered had never been about proving anything. It had been about trust, about leaving something unharmed, about holding wonder in your palm and not squeezing until it shattered. Sometimes Barrett still dreamed of them, of Cinder's eyes in the dark, of Sprout coughing under that damp wool, of the quiet touch on his arm from something bigger than any story could explain. But he never woke afraid. The dreams were not haunting. They were grounding, like reminders sent from far away just to say, "You did right." The shed remained empty that summer, clean, ready. No one said it, but no one used it either. It was left open sometimes, just in case. The blankets were folded, the bowls stayed washed, the straw was replaced every few weeks, and in the corner, a drawing hung, tacked to the wall. 2 figures under the trees, one taller, back turned, the other crouched, hand outstretched. The only color in the sketch was a small blue marble in the dirt between them. Vera never moved it, not even when the wind blew hard and knocked it crooked. She'd just straighten it again. One evening in August, Barrett stood by the back fence, arms crossed, breathing slow. The woods looked darker than usual, not menacing, just heavier, like it knew something he didn't. And then, through the thinning summer green, he saw 2 shapes slip between the trees, small, moving together, one slightly ahead, then gone. He didn't follow, didn't call out, just stood there a while, hand resting on the old cedar post. A gust of wind passed behind him. The wind chimes tapped once, then stillness, and all around him the forest held, quiet, alive, and listening. He let out a breath, turned, and went inside. And from then on, he stopped waiting for proof, because sometimes knowing was enough. In the quiet corners of the world, beneath the canopy of old forests, along forgotten trails where the wind carries more than just the scent of pine, there still exist stories too sacred to shout, too fragile to name. They are not about what was caught or proven, not about what could be explained under a microscope or captured in a photograph. They are about what was protected, what was returned, what was quietly held in 2 hands without trying to own it. Some truths don't demand to be believed. They only ask to be respected. And sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't loud declarations, but silent choices. To step back instead of forward, to listen instead of interrupt, to preserve instead of expose. This story was never about discovery in the way we usually crave it. It was about stewardship, about humility, about the simple, radical belief that coexistence begins not with understanding, but with reverence. We live in a world that too often mistakes power for control, knowledge for possession, but there are still places, still moments, where something older than us brushes against the edge of what we know and doesn't run. It waits, watches, tests whether we'll meet it with fear or with grace. And when we choose grace, when we leave space for what can't be tamed, we are reminded of something most of us forget, that the most extraordinary connections often come from the gentlest acts of compassion. Maybe the lesson isn't to search harder, but to see softer. Maybe wonder isn't something we chase into the dark, but something that returns to us when we've finally learned how to be still. Thank you for listening, truly. If this story moved something in you, if it stirred a memory, a question, or even just a quiet moment of reflection, we'd love to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share what this meant to you. And if you'd like to walk with us again, through more woods, more questions, more stories whispered between the trees, please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, take care of each other, and leave a little space at the edge of the woods. You never know who's listening.